Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit more about Orb Sceptre Throne. Philip Chase and I had a fun discussion, spoiler-filled discussion about this. But one of the concepts that comes up in Orb Sceptre Throne, actually, and it comes up in all of the novels of the Malazan Empire, and actually in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, this idea of taking a concept, presenting it in one form, then using the same concept and presenting it in a different light. And that way, as a reader, you get to compare and contrast the two. So it's not about saying this is the only way to do something, it's showing you two different ways of doing something and the potential repercussions for that. And I really enjoy this technique. And the idea of these different positions. One of the things that Esslemont does in Orb Sceptre Throne, at least I think Esslemont does in Orb Sceptre Throne, it sets up a lot of binary opposites or dyadic poles or parallel structures where we see one form of it and another form of it, and the narrative is implying a point of connection that we should be sort of comparing and contrasting it. And obviously, one of the most obvious of these are concern the Moranth and the Segula, where the Segula are very tradition bound. They are wrapped up in a backward looking, tradition bound elevation and hyper stylization of a way of life. It is taken to an absolute extreme. And that is contrasted with the Moranth, who in some ways are, while they are obsessed with their ancient enemy, as they are about the Segula, because, you know, a lot of what the Moranth have done is specifically to combat the threat of the Segula. They cannot look past this. But they have, instead of trying to perfect a form, they have looked at the future. They have analyzed the position they have looked at their strengths, they have looked at their weaknesses, and they are looking forward. They are trying to evolve. So with the Segula, there's this ancient tradition of using swords. And obviously, like in fantasy worlds, we know about melee. We know that this is pre-industrial, pre-rifles, pre-guns, all of this sort of thing. So it's all about the perfection of that form. And they look at it in terms of dueling. And that is a very specific thing, because obviously we could contrast that with the Malazans, who look at everything in terms of an efficient military. And this is one of the great aspects of fantasy that sometimes gets glossed over. There's a significant difference between a warrior, particularly depicted in fantasy, and a soldier. So if we think of the Roman legion, the Roman legion lined up in a shield wall, they had their gladius, and they would sit and basically poke through. It was a meat grinder. And it was these very competent, professional armies, tight discipline. And sure, in a one-on-one fight, you might have had a Gaulish warrior who could take out a Roman legionnaire. But when you have a whole load of Gaulish warriors who have a loose formation, who have all these different sorts of weapons of varying lengths, and they have to take space around them to do their swings, whereas you have the Roman legion, very tightly packed, defensive shield wall. And what they're doing is a more efficient way of approaching battle. Now, obviously, Roman historians and anyone with a knowledge of history or military history will know a lot more about this. But this is my sort of rough general conception of it. So if we think of the Segula, they have perfected the single warrior art form. We see this in certain other cultures as well. I mean, if we think of the great samurai tradition, it was all about the one warrior on their own with their various swords, their various bows. They were a walking one-man army. But that pales into insignificance when faced with modern warfare. Because sure, if you're faced off against 150 poorly armed peasants who don't have any armor and don't have proper weapons or proper training, a single warrior can cut through all of that. But as soon as you're faced off against a tightly disciplined army, that changes things a lot. So the Segula elevate this art form, and it is, I think we can make some generic, bland, generalized comparisons between the Segula and, say, the samurai tradition, that it's the perfection of the martial art to its highest, most perfect, most beautiful form. And there still is that part of it being, it's martial. It is about destroying, killing, maiming. But when we see the Segula in the books, particularly Jan, and when we look at the various duels, it's all about being perfect in form and proving how good you are, rather than trying to kill someone. Whereas the Moranth looked at this, they saw how technically brilliant or powerful or excellent the Segula were with swords, and went, we cannot stand up to that. So what we have to do is think of this as a military conquest. So the Moranth found the quarrels. They went into a selective breeding program to breed an air force, so that the Segula could be as powerful as they want, as brilliant as they want with swords. But if someone is 50 feet up, you can't reach them. So we can see the Moranth are thinking of their enemy and not thinking about how can I beat them on their own terms. They're thinking about how I can win, which is a very different way of thinking about the contest or the conflict between the two. It is an alien way of thinking to the Segula, because if the Segula were faced with someone, it's like, well, yes, within the Agadi, we have this form, this tradition, these rules, these structures about how I'm allowed to challenge, who I can challenge, and how often I can challenge them, and how much training I have to go through. Whereas the Moranth are thinking, how can I win? And we can see that the Moranth in that respect are much more similar to how we think of the Malazans, this very pragmatic, forward thinking, but almost utilitarian view of what is the best way to win the conflict, rather than what is the best way to win the contest. So the Moranth then, obviously, and they develop munitions. And Philip and I spoke about how the munitions, these alchemical explosives, signal the change in the world that has already been signaled by the fact that a modern military like the Malazan force, or sorry, I should say contemporary military like the Malazan force, has already changed things. The inclusion of magic into that military structure, the inclusion of the munitions into that military structure. The Malazans take from all these different cultures, they learn from these different cultures, they adapt, and they move on. The Moranth focused on a certain aspect of it, and where we see these differences that I've been highlighting so far, but where we see the point of comparison is the Moranth are still locked into this tradition, this past. They are focused solely on the Segula and ways to beat the Segula. They are not looking, they're not forward thinking or progressive thinking in terms of their place in the world. And we see the brutalness of the Segula when people do not conform to their cultural expectations or their place in the world. Like we've seen that in previous books where the Segula have arrived on someone else's ship and gone, we are taking these things. And they just assume that they can take them because might makes right. The Moranth have a similar brutal outlook, which is we saw at the Siege of Pale and Gardens of the Moon. Pale competed with them for trade contracts, and the Moranth take an hour of blood to slaughter people in retribution for beating them at trade. Not, they got a trade contract that we wanted, time to up our game, maybe do our tender a bit differently. Let's go and slaughter men, women, and children. There's a brutality to this single-minded focus. These are very insular, focused cultures that are not about taking the best or divergent or diverse views from across the world and learning from them. It's all about their focus and their tradition. So they are very much bound up in their traditions, in their past, and it is defining who they are. And they both have very regimented cultures. The Moranth have their caste system, the different colors assigned to all of these things about how they organize and stratify their society. The Segula have the Agari, and they have this whole stratified society. And when we compare that to something like the Malazans, we can see how alien that concept is, separating the society out. So we can put the Moranth and the Segula sort of almost in direct contrast and opposition as a binary opposite to the Malazans. And so there's a lot going on here with these sort of structures and investigations of this thing. And again, Esslemont is at pains to present these things not in a judgmental light, but to try and show them, to show that there are strengths and weaknesses to it. Like, think of how powerful the Segula are because they have dedicated their time, they have focused their time on perfecting dueling and swordplay. Think of the scientific advances made by this research into alchemical explosives and the idea of creating an air force that the Moranth have because they're so single-minded. And yet, think of the flexibility that is demonstrated by the Malazans because it's about learning and drawing from these different cultures and amalgamating them into your own sort of worldview to learn and move forward. There are strengths and weaknesses to all these approaches. So the next sort of binary opposite or parallel structure I wanted to talk about was the academic dig that Eben runs, where he uncovers the tyrant, and contrast that to the gold rush mentality of the run to loot Moonspawn. Both of these are obviously, well, I would assume, issues that an archaeologist like Ainsley Esslemont has come across. The idea of an academic digging down to find out about the past, to see these things, to uncover the truth and the history, and to learn. And one of the things that we know about the warding placed on the tyrant's tomb is that the only person who was going to be safe in it was someone who wasn't trying to be acquisitive, someone who was actually more inquisitive, who just wanted to know, that their intention in it is pretty pure. It's about finding out. It's not about desecrating. It's not about looting. It's not about stealing. It's not about profiting. It's about knowledge and learning and understanding. And that is, obviously quite a noble pursuit. And yet at the same time, it results in the tyrant being unleashed. But is it because of his investigation, or is it because a more acquisitive, dangerous, almost, would you go as far as capitalist? Probably, you could make that argument. But because someone else steps in to use it, who doesn't have that intention, who has a different intention, that's what actually sets this whole chain of things off. That the idea of finding and looting, using for power, all of these things, instead of the interest in to learn from, it's about how can this make me more powerful? And that changes the nature of the academic dig into something closer to Moonspawn and that mentality. But with Moonspawn, what we saw there was purely capitalist greed. It's the idea of looting and sacking and stealing, picking over the carcass of a dead culture or the remains of something for personal gain. And we see how that has turned, yes, it has provided a boom town sort of mentality to this area where people can make money, but we see that it's actually destroyed a lot of the culture, that it is now more violent. It has that Wild West feel. And it's led to people oppressing others, people betraying others, that the drive solely for material gain with no intention to learn, to find out, can be incredibly destructive. So there's this really nice parallel. But what is the worst that happens with the gold rush mentality at Moonspawn? Moonspawn sinks. What's the worst that happens with the academic dig that Eben undergoes? Unleashes an immortal tyrant who's going to try and take over the world. So again, it's not that one is entirely positive and one is entirely negative. It's examining these different things by showing us these examples, putting them in contrast with each other within the same narrative. Because we could look at this and go, but what does the Moonspawn Gold Rush have to do with any of the rest of the story? It really feels loosely connected to the events in Darujistan. But at the same time, thematically, it is absolutely essential because, again, like the Moranth and the Segula, the Eben's academic dig and the Moonspawn, it's looking at the past and the impact that the past can have on the future, or the present leading to the future. All of these things are tied together. We are not divorced from our past. We are not separated from our past. The past is always with us, and the past has repercussions. So I think even though the Moonspawn sections, when you look at it strictly from a what is necessary for what is happening to Darujistan, it doesn't feel as connected. But as soon as you consider the thematic element of what is being explored here to see how they connect, it makes a lot more sense, and it fits so much more neatly and cohesively into the grander structure of the narrative that is being presented. Because we see that with the Moranth, with the Segula, with the academic dig, with Moonspawn, they are all dealing with this aspect of the importance of the past and how we deal with the past. So it is cohesive, it is connected. And then that brings us on to like a really interesting sort of dynamic that gets set up. And that's within the Segula themselves, the conflicts that we see, like Jan with the third, we see these various duels that occur within the Segula, but also Jan's conflict with the past when he finds out that the past is not what they thought it was. And we contrast that then with Dassam. So both Jan and Dassam are dealing with very uncomfortable truths. Dassam has withdrawn from the world because he is responsible for killing Anamanda Rake, and that is weighing very heavily on him. He is an ascendant. He is associated with sorrow, with loss, and is trying to find his place. Jan, on the other hand, is dealing with the fact that their entire history that he had believed in is pretty much a lie. So he is dealing with those psychological ramifications of having your entire underpinning and your belief in the world cut away from you and being adrift. Quite a lot like Dassam. Dassam lived by the sword. Jan lives by the sword. And yet both of them have found their reason for this has been removed. So they're set up very much as very similar sorts of characters. And when we get that build up to the idea that maybe they're going to face off against each other, this is where we see that point of contrast, where Dassam is more forward looking. It's not about being locked into the past. It's about learning from the past. Whereas Jan sees that the Segula are locked in the past and they need new leadership who can think outside the box, who has a different perspective, who can guide them in a new direction that honors who they are, because Dassam, as a swordsman, as a warrior, as a skilled wielder of a blade, Dassam can honor that aspect of them, but can show them a new direction to channel that. Whereas if Jan or any of the others became the leader, because they grew up in that society, they are internal to that society, they are internal to that structure, they cannot really see the same sort of way forward. They would only be a continuation of what has already been established. So again, there's this really nice parallel between these characters, setting themselves up as different ways of honoring the past, but also looking to the future. And what's fascinating about this is, like, we've heard about how good Dassam is, but we actually see Jan basically float through all of these fights. The one time that he is truly unleashed, he sort of goes into a Zen calm and just runs through all of these soldiers, killing them without a thought, without a care. And then it's only at the end of that whole sequence that he comes back to himself and sort of looks round and realizes that he's been injured, that he's just been in the moment. He has been entirely part of this. And we see a lot of that with Dassam and his attitude to what the sword is, what the sword represents. And in the temple, Dassam has that spiritual aspect, but has moved it away from the need to kill. And so there is this idea of the perfection of the art, the perfection of the form. And, you know, as I had mentioned in the video with Philip, you know, there's a lot of the classic martial arts film, martial arts story, but there is something of the samurai here, of the perfection of a martial art, but becoming more aware of the fact that, you know, the modern world has arrived, warfare has changed, the shogunate cannot survive the same way that it did. So I think that's a really interesting pairing of the two of them, and could actually bear up some really interesting character analysis of how these two relate to this theme of the importance of being aware of the past, learning from the past, and using it to build and learn and grow, or being locked into the past and being locked into honoring the tradition for tradition's sake. That both are very interesting worldviews that have some strengths and some weaknesses. But the last sort of setup that I wanted to discuss was about the legate, Jeshin Lim, and Humble Measure. And for those of you that hate this character, it's going to involve a discussion of Krupp as well. But both Jeshin Lim and Humble Measure had cooked up this plan that they were going to change the fate of Darujistan, that they were going to do something to acquire more power, to do things more efficiently, because the cabal was moving things behind the scenes. The Il was constantly interfering with things. That what they wanted was a concentration of power. They wanted to consolidate their power and take the fight to the Malazans. But what we see is Jeshin Lim takes the power as legate, and then he goes his own way. Let's build up the defenses first, and then we see that gets taken over, obviously, by the tyrant and what's going on there. Humble Measure then feels betrayed. But what we have are two different people who want exactly the same thing. They want to increase the power and respect and political weight of Darujistan. They want Darujistan to succeed. They want Darujistan to become a power on the continent again, to rise back to the level it used to have. They were great in the past. They are no longer great. They want to resurrect the past. With the legate, we see that literally resurrects the tyrant. But with Humble Measure, he was falling into the trap of the only way to improve is build up your army and go and invade other people. That it's a zero-sum game, that you have to take from others in order to expand. So both of these characters are approaching this in different ways. They're both trying to achieve what they think is the same goal, but obviously in different ways, which leads to it actually being different goals. And then we have the third sort of strand of this coming in, and Krupp manipulating things to say, no, there's no reason, you do not need to detract from another in order to elevate yourself. And if you think about it, like very simply, structurally, one way, if two people are equal, you can cut the legs out of someone and they are less than, therefore you technically have been elevated. Or you can do the work and you can become elevated while they don't do any work. That's basically what's going on here. Both Humble Measure and Jeshin Lim think about the need to destroy others in order to elevate themselves, whereas Krupp is manipulating things so that it's, no, let's focus on building ourselves up regardless of what other people do. And instead of direct conflict, instead of subjugating others, instead of destroying others, Krupp, yes, manipulates people, but he's doing it for a way to improve the lives of everyone around him. And that I think, is an interesting contrast that gets set up with these different approaches to what's happening in Darujistan. So it's just a short little video about this, because when we read a lot of these novels that have multiple points of view, multiple points of view can be used in very different ways. We can use multiple points of view to tell individual stories that sort of wind together to form a main narrative. And we see a lot of that in, say, something like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, that it's not that the different points of view are necessarily there to highlight something in another point of view. It's that this is what's happening to that character. Or we can see multiple points of view as ways of exploring certain themes, certain character traits or narrative structures, and seeing them from different directions, because each POV is actually exploring it and allowing you to weigh up these different things yourself. And when taken all together, that's what forms the narrative. So I thought this was interesting. I thought it was worth chatting about. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.